pendulum so
You
far that
start
way
having these
that when we
people
start
that
calling
want
people
these
that have like miraculous
Pentecostal type
conversion experience,
experiences, and
right?
then
There's
it
an
just
extreme on
never
both
happens.
ends. We just got to stay humble to some
Well, and
degree.
you know, I get driven insane because you know you're going to tell me these people are converted, and then they say, well, if you don't tell them that they can do these things, you're hindering the grace of God. Well, again, we return to Jude 4, and the accusative is still there. It says, turning the grace of our God, the favor, the charis of our God, into licentiousness, as the Nasby translates it. Well, these free grace types are the ones who are saying you can be a witch, a black high priestess, for example, worship that way, go on that way, and somehow still be saved. I'm sorry, is that the grace of God, or are you perverting the grace of God? Let's stop and think about what we're saying here. You tell them they need to believe because they're faithless toward Christ, and then throwing them right back to the pit of sin out of which they were redeemed. It makes no sense.
Hello.
Yeah, what the heck does that kind of belief even mean? I don't even know what that means, to be honest. It's like a race. Like I said, it's like a race to the bottom.
Right. I think you said it very well, but we got a new panelist. Hello, Mark.
Hello, I'm Mark Reid. I'm an atheist, and I heard you talking. I was just dropping by, and I just had some questions for you, if you would indulge me, of course. Because I heard you talking on the idea that some people are intelligent or they're geniuses and they still don't get saved. And I was wondering sort of what the criteria actually is and its moral justification.
That's a good question, actually. So, first, let me say that from our perspective as Christians, there's really, at least biblically, I won't say all Christians feel this way. There's really no such thing as good people per se. Now, from our perspective as human beings, of course, there is, in the sense that, like, there's Jeffrey Dahmers and there's Mother Teresa's, and they're not equivalent in the human, manner of speaking. But before God, there's really no such thing as good people. And I think philosophically, there's a lot of demonstration of that also, but I won't necessarily get into all of it. But, I think people are primarily, on top of capable of evil things, primarily motivated by, selfishness and a couple other things like that, and, et cetera, et cetera. Um, Looks like Ryan's going to be going to sleep. But anyways, shalom, Ryan. Thank you for being here. Anyway, back to the point. So I bring that up only to say that you can't be morally good enough to be saved. That's not a possibility on the biblical worldview, because everybody has done at least one thing wrong, and most people have actually done many things wrong, and most people are even, you know, the things that they don't do wrong are primarily, at least in my own view, and I think this is scriptural as well, kind of the result of circumstance. Just to give a brief example of that, if you go back to Nazi Germany, and there's nothing particularly unique about Germans. Germans are people just like anyone else. But if
Right.
you go back to Nazi Germany, it's not like there was a whole lot of people saying, "Hey, don't do that. That's not cool." For the most part, everybody got along to get along. And so statistically, we always ask people the question, well, or people ask themselves the question, if I lived in the 1940s in Germany, I'd be different. But statistically, you actually wouldn't be. Statistically speaking,
Yeah, I
you'd be
don't
going
think that's
anyone else.
necessarily the truth. I remember the book The Banality of Evil, which was a guy who ran one of the gas chamber sort of things, and he was just a guy doing a job, which is
Right.
kind of scary. But that sort of it's very strange to hear you talk, because that's kind of a subjective, sort of just a relativistic morality that you've sort of described there. And you said that good and doesn't really apply to people, or that applies to people rather. Um, so don't you think good and evil are things that can be applied to a God concept?
Well, yeah. So to make sure we clarify, right? When I say that good and evil don't necessarily apply, what I mean is that I take a view that humans we're basically fundamentally bad. I'm very, I'll be honest, just very cynical in my view of humankind, which includes my own self. And I think that the reason I bring up the Nazi example is just simply to say that, like, I think that we often, because we're in good circumstances, right, grew up in the 21st century, running water, a democracy, all that kind of stuff, we tend to think of ourselves as better than others. But if we lived at those places and in those times, statistically speaking, it's much more likely that we would be doing the things that they were doing. Like, I don't believe the members of the German army were inherently more evil than other young 18-year-old boys who joined the military. They just did, and it happened to be there. That being said, though, where salvation then comes in is that the law, namely the law of Moses, demonstrates that wickedness before people and also how seriously God takes it. So his penalty for it is death, and also he lists out all the different things which are bad, which kind of put a mirror in your face. Hey, you do this, this, and this, and I believe the penalty for that is death.
Sure.
And it's meant to kind of guide people to understand not only what I was just kind of saying there as far as human nature, but also necessity for a savior. And then by virtue of accepting that savior, you have not only a license into heaven, but also, I believe, something that genuinely changes the person such that they don't want to do those things anymore.
So your only criteria for sort of salvation is sort of accepting Jesus as a savior. That's the only criteria.
Basically, yes. That would be the thing. But it's also something which I believe. I think if somebody has truly accepted Christianity, that it does lead to a behavioral change. In other words, the behavioral change doesn't come first. But I think that since I do believe in God, I do believe that those who are truly in relationship with Him will not want to do these things, such that you might have people objecting to the Nazi government or whatever other situation you might be in.
I don't think that's necessarily the case. The Germans did have Gott mein uns written on their belts, that God was with us. So a large percentage of the Nazis were Christian, at least Catholic or Protestant of some sort.
Right.
And there's been no end of people who are religious committing atrocities throughout the world. It doesn't seem to be something that they're exempted from. I'm not going to say that they're the only people. Absolutely not. I wouldn't make that claim that they're the only people out there doing it, because it seems to be a facet of the entire human species. But it does seem to be something that people that say they've accepted Jesus, I mean, I don't know how you would tell if they in fact have or not. It doesn't seem to prevent them from atrocities or anything like that. And you brought up Mosaic Law, and some of those laws, don't... do you think those laws still hold true today?
Yeah, so I think there is some theology you have to get into with them. So, like, for example, the New Testament, I think, explains a deeper symbolic meaning behind kosher laws, for example, which we see in the form of Peter's vision in the book of Acts. Which, if you have further questions, we'll get into that. But nonetheless, that's why I wouldn't necessarily condemn somebody for eating like a shrimp or pork or something like that. Though, for the record, I as a pork eater will freely admit that it's disgusting, and it's very weird that we eat a pig that is probably not particularly healthy for us, and also probably more intelligent than an animal we should be eating. But I digress on that. But yes, the short answer is yes. I think that the moral laws there do apply, in so much that they are the proper way to live. Not being obedient to your parents, for example, not committing adultery.
But that's what I was going to bring up. The penalty for being disrespectful of your parents, and I believe the criteria is drinking and sleeping in during the day. The penalty for that is clearly death.
Yes. So now that's an excellent question, because, well, not really a question, but I know what you're getting at.
Yeah. I guess the question is, do you still think we should kill children or young men or women as well, I guess, who are drinking and sleeping in and being disrespectful to their parents? Do you think that should be the death penalty?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the answer is no. Now let me give the explanation here, because it is a great question.
Sure.
I think the point of not just that law, but the entire Mosaic Law, is that sort of teaching element. So let's just take the example of a disobedient child. I myself was a very disobedient child. I've actually spent stints in juvie as a result of my disobedientness.
As was I believe. Yeah, I think I was as well when I was a young man. Got up to a lot of no good.
Now, from the perspective of at least the modern day Christian, which of course means we have the New Testament and stuff like that. So I only word it that way to say, an Orthodox Jew may not agree with this.
Right.
But the point of that law is to teach two different things. It's not necessarily to be used as a means of executing the child or anything like that, right? But it's to, number one, teach me as the disobedient child that this is something which is sinful and that I need atonement for. And number two, to teach me as the disobedient child just how seriously God takes that. He considers it to be something that is worthy of death. And then knowing those two things, I not only would seek not to do those things, provided that I actually have a solid understanding of that and want to serve it, right? But also have a means at that, or not a means at that point, but a reason at that point to seek Jesus for atonement, right? Like we always say, are you saved? But what are you saved from, right? Well, this being saved from is the curse of that law which says, this is the penalty for the sins you commit. And so we're basically saying there's a option to get out of that, right? And that option is Jesus Christ. So then when it comes to the legal element, I don't think you should be basing your legal doctrine, whatever you decide to call it, on what the Old Testament says, because I don't think that's necessarily the point of the Old Testament. I think the point is to, of course, be a moral teaching, but also to demonstrate the severity of sin and the necessity for a savior.
Well, it sounds like what you're sort of saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like what you're saying is that you're saved from the punishment if you're a Christian and have accepted the Savior, but not if you're not a Christian.
Well, so yes, but I want to add a little asterisk here, which is that doesn't mean that I have a right to penalize you as a non-Christian, because I think since that point is meant to be this more moral, spiritual point, I don't think its intention is to be legal document. In other words, God's the one who's going to carry out the penalty after death, not something that we do here now.
Yeah, but that isn't what the Mosaic Law says. It sort of says that the people should take them out in front of, I believe it's the tabernacle, and stone them to death. Sort of even describes the exact punishment done for the young person who was being slothful.
One way to read that too, though, in application in that time was potentially that, they had to be, there's like how that would be carried out or interpreted would be like kind of how we have like maximum sentences. So like it doesn't mean like your kid like doesn't put his toys away so you stone him, but it's more like more severe cases of disobedience, like presumably an older child, the high, that would be like a maximum sentence, so to speak, or whatever, under anything that falls under that category. So I forget what you call that, but
well, I mean, it's very.
That's the way it was applied.
Yeah. I just disagree. It's very specific. It says that a young man that sleeps in and disrespects their parents and is drunk all the time. It's very specific about what the person should have done. But look, I've got no problem if you think that it's sort of pointing out a moral error, and then but you don't think the punishment should apply anymore. It's just kind of strange to hear that. That the Old Testament holds for its moral designations, but not its moral consequence.
Well, and I can certainly understand that view. Right now, real quickly, I want to just share something here very briefly to kind of give you an idea where we're coming from. So this is not Old Testament. This is Galatians.
Right.
Specifically 3:24. And Paul here says, "Wherefore the law was our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith." So the point here is kind of exactly what I'm explaining to you, right? Which is that this law serves the function of, this is, first off, it's impossible to attain. Second off, it demonstrates all the sinful things that people do, right? As C.S. Lewis once said, nobody knows how bad he is until he tries very hard to be good. And then number 3, it demonstrates just how vicious God's prescribed penalty is. And it is indeed vicious. I mean, I certainly don't get warm, cuddly feelings about people stoning children, right?
Right.
But then Paul says that the point of this law is that it's a schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ, right? Now, again, I would recognize an Orthodox Jew might have a different understanding of this than I would because of his non-acceptance of the New Testament.
Right.
But what essentially you see here is Israel is sort of like the example. Hey, the law doesn't, I don't want to say doesn't work, because that's not exactly correct, but it provides nothing but death for humans, basically is the point. If we're under the law, we are under what is essentially a curse. And then Christ then comes here as sort of a relieving of that curse, which is intended to be.
When you say it's kind of interesting that, so like when he does the Sermon on the Mount, which is prophesied in Isaiah 42, right, that he would magnify the law and make it honorable, and it says, but then, so it's like he lowers, and he forgives the woman when they go to stone her, the woman in adultery, right, and he writes in the sand, but then he ends up also telling her not to go and sin no more. But he, when they try to condemn her and take her right to being stoned, he, makes them into hypocrites, so to speak, and sends them off. And so then, but then he ups the ante on the law, in that, if you even look at a woman, it's like committing adultery, or if you hate somebody, it's like murder. But yet, so he ups the ante on the actual laws, the morality of the law, yet he lowers the penalty. It's kind of an interesting dynamic.
So
sorry.
What I want to know is there's people that have sort of accepted Christ that have done pretty horrible things. So I guess the latest one was Dharma in jail, sort of repenting on his in his cell. And do you think that should have any weight, even if they really mean it? Is that the designation of who is saved?
Well, I can't speak for Dahmer in the sense of, I don't know, that's between him and God. I don't know what his heart was at. But to speak in the abstract, let's just assume that there is a real God and he really did.
Yeah, let's assume he really believed it.
Yeah, I would. So in that instance, I would say yes. I believe that ultimately, I believe there is very little that separates you and I and Jamie and et cetera from Dahmer. And I think we like to think of ourselves as not. Say again?
Do you think so?
Indeed. I think that it's natural for people to not want to think of themselves as equal to people who do detestable things. And of course, in day-to-day society, you can't, right? Because obviously we're not in prison and Dahmer is, and that needs to be the way it is because he's committed crimes. But as far as from the perspective of, here, let me actually.
Well, I don't think it's just that he's committed crimes. I think that he is, in the classical sense, a psychopath. He's got no sense of empathy whatsoever. So he, killed and ate people. I'm sorry if it's getting a bit crude, but that's what he did.
No, you're okay.
Because he has no sense of empathy whatsoever. I think that's a vast thing between ordinary humans who, people that aren't psychopaths, that do have a sense of empathy, and people who are born without that sense of empathy whatsoever. I think there's a vast gulf between them.
And one would think, right? But then when you look at, and let me give the example right now of history, and we already brought up the Nazi example, but that's such an easy example to go to, right? What about, like, for example, the Roman example? I just used the word example like 4 times. It's a little redundant. My apologies. But at any rate, let's say you and I are Marcus and Christianos. My real name's Christian. And we live back in the ancient times.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of the things that we'll just go do, I mean, provided we have the money, of course, it's the same thing as going to a football game in the sense that it's going to cost a lot. But provided we have the money, we're just going to go and just watch some poor, Christian mother or gypsy mother or what have you be mauled alive by a lion. And, rah, rah, all this other kind of stuff, you know what I mean? And it's like, you think of yourself as very empathetic, but you have an entire society of really highly civilized people and intelligent people and even morally adept people in a lot of ways just going and just watching that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And this is where I kind of brought up the thing earlier where it's like, you know, when we look at somebody like Dahmer, it's very tempting for us to think he's so much different than us. But really, we have a lot of evidence to suggest humans kind of do Dahmer-like stuff a lot, sometimes on a massive cultural scale. And we're really kind of blessed, not in the divine sense necessarily, but just in a general sense, to live in a society where that's not normal. You know, we've all heard the example of Native Americans scalping people.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what people don't often realize is what they'd actually do is the warrior would scalp his kill, and then he'd wear him around his belt buckle to show the rest of the tribe, this is how many people I've killed. Look at how awesome of a warrior I am. Which is, I mean, that's incredibly Dahmer-esque, but it's the entire society.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, the Europeans and Americans like to refer to them as savages, but of course we were doing the same thing and slaughtering them en masse. You know, it was all the same.
Right. But yeah, what's interesting to note is they wouldn't do it among themselves, right? So,
right.
Well, the way we look at empathy sort of, it seems to be this emotive force that only applies to people of our same society. When you move somebody outside the society, it's very easy for humans to go, well, that sense of empathy doesn't apply to them anymore. It's that dehumanization process that we say, hey, they're an other. They're not part of what I'd consider to be me and mine. And that opens the door. The difference is that psychopaths, they have no sense of empathy whatsoever, even for the closest person to them. To say they got married, they're very good at faking it and sort of pretending to have empathy, but they might be married and still have no empathy whatsoever for that person, regardless of whether they're the closest person or they're another person on the other side of the world. And that's the big difference between psychopaths and, to a lesser degree, sociopaths, but mostly psychopaths with no sense of empathy whatsoever.
Yeah, and certainly not a poor point, but it is also something that if you think about it, it does kind of, how do I want to put this? It demonstrates to a certain extent that we're kind of capable of really disregarding that empathy. And in this case, you brought up a good example, right? How it's like we disregard that empathy a lot of times in regards to people who are named the others, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, so for somebody like Dahmer, the only thing that you actually really have to extend that to is for him, the others are everybody else, right? And in his case, it's actually, you know, he's a very isolated individual. He was a closeted homosexual at a time when that was not okay, so that allows him to disassociate from people and think to himself, I'm different. I'm not accepted as one of the group or something like that. You know what I mean? By the way, I'm not saying that to say a closeted homosexual would just necessarily do that, but just to say, you know, he's otherized by society and therefore has no problem otherizing said society, right? And you kind of can go down the line in a way to just say, like, really that macro scale that you see in the form of scalpings and genocides and gladiatorial combat and stuff like that, Dahmer just does on a micro scale, to say that the others are everybody who's not him. You know what I mean? And in the same way that I would say, I would open the door to repentance for the Nazi, the gladiator, the Native American warrior, the Union soldier who kills the Native American warrior, you know, I would see the same necessity for somebody like a Dahmer, who's really, in a way, acting more in line with what we see in human history than me and you are. Thank God, by the way. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's a very good thing. But, you know, it must be noted he's doing things that are, if the use of normal is to say normative, he was doing things that were actually kind of normal in human society. We kill, we eat each other. I mean, rape has only been a crime in the West for like 300 years. Well, rape in so much as that it wasn't a property crime. Let me be specific about that. You know, and so it's like, to go back to the original point, it's like it's tempting, like I said, to want to say this guy, he's so much different than us. But I think, honestly, I think that betrays a historical view of humanity, and even in a lot of ways, even a modern view of humanity. I mean, we have a lot of people, like, there's nothing inherently different about an Afghani. and yet in Afghanistan you have honor killings and selling of young boys into sex slavery and stuff like that all the time. Now, is it that there's something inherently different about them? Well, of course not. That'd be some form of xenophobia, right? But there is something that kind of allows them to take that empathy and just sort of toss it in the trash for a minute.
Sure.
And in that case, it is their own kind, right? I'm probably not the right word to use, but I think you know what I'm getting at. Their own tribe is a better word to use.
But see, that's relative morality. That's just morality that's relative to the place that you're coming from and who you view as an other or enemy. So that can change depending on what kind of structure you're built up in. But as far as sort of a moral thing goes, what you're suggesting is that even though that someone like Dharma or any other psychopaths out there do these things, they're going to get eternal rewards for them, whereas somebody that's tried to be kind and helpful and tried to help everybody they meet and be nice to them is going to be punished for all eternity, simply based upon whether they believe that Jesus is the Savior or not.
Well, so first off, let me just I'll bite your bullet for a moment, just so you know I'm not yanking your chain. There is a serious yes to that.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think that the reason for that is that, kind of like I'm saying here, I don't think that we're as fundamentally different from Dahmer as we would like to believe. And I think a lot of times circumstances are the only reason why we behave differently than Dahmer and Nazi and gladiators and so on, which creates a necessity for all people to have some level of atonement. Now, I think it's probably more likely that the kindly grandma would recognize that than the Dahmer would. And Frank Turek famously gives the Gandhi versus Capone quote, where Al Capone thought he was a really good dude and Gandhi thought he was a terrible guy. I think those things tend to go hand in hand. Usually the better you are morally, the worse you think of yourself, at least in my own view. And I think that has a lot to do with the sort of recognition of human nature and just how kind of bad it is. But with that being said, to get back to the actual point you're making, that a lot. Sorry, I want to word this the right way. A lot of times, the thing that causes somebody to not act in that detestable way is that they were raised in a circumstance where that wasn't something that people did culturally, or they didn't have the opportunity to do so. Which you can see examples of that in places like Venezuela, right, where the culture was just the same as ours I assume in England, and I'm here in America.
Australia.
So same culture as that what we would have, in the sense that it's first world, Western, highly influenced by the Enlightenment and Protestant Christianity and etc. In fact, Venezuela, I think, might be a little bit Catholic Christianity, but neither here nor there in this instance. But then as soon as the government collapsed, people started getting pretty evil again, right? And it's because now you weren't raised in that circumstance, but the opportunities to be evil have kind of amplified.
Sure.
And people start acting that way again, and so it's not that you're wrong in your assessment here. You're saying that like one person has done some detestable things and another person hasn't, and yet the other person ends up, because of their repentance, going on to bliss. But the difference that we have, I think, between my view and your view would be that I see the person who didn't do it as really more of a product of circumstance than a product of good moral choices, usually, not always. And because of that, I see both as having kind of equal standing before all righteous being.
That's almost like a deterministic view, sort of that all of our decisions are based upon the prior circumstances that were set up out of our control. It kind of almost precludes a free will kind of argument. But your sort of thing about the environment creating somebody, that the science sort of disagrees with you, at least as far as psychopaths are concerned. They're literally born without the necessary empathic responses. Whereas I think that you're more thinking of the sociopath, which their sociopathy is a product of the environment that they're into. So I would acknowledge that may hold true for a sociopath, but it doesn't for a psychopath who literally has no sense of empathy they can draw on. It's just not there. and that's sort of what the science says about psychopathy versus sociopathy. But um, the idea that somebody you know, I think I lean toward compatibilism. So I think that you can be in the same circumstances and still have a different outcome for individuals. I don't think that your decisions are entirely up to a deterministic set of circumstances that you were born into or that you got carried through. I think there has to be some kind of responsibility for the individual to make choices. And I get what you're saying, that humans, you know, I think Noam Chomsky once said that humans have the capability to be a saint and a gas chamber attendant. I think that's true. But a lot of that is relative to the situation that you're placed in and the relativistic circumstance that you are in at the time. There's plenty of brutal killers out there who work for governments that would never harm their own family, like ever. There seems to be a relative sort of limit on their violations of sort of what we consider good and evil. There's plenty of Marines or SAS over here that, you know, as long as you point them at the enemy, they are brutal killers, but they would never harm somebody from their own country. And that's where I'm getting into sort of this sense of empathy for those that you consider part of your circle, sort of a tribalism almost, and those that you consider outside of it. And Dharma did, I mean, I know he was a loner, but he certainly worked within society. And a lot of these people who are psychopaths do. They pretend to have a sense of empathy while not having one. Some psychopaths have even been married and gone on to kill people. It doesn't seem like considering everybody some part of other is really the guiding factor there. It seems whether you can empathize with people and understand what they're going through. And I think that empathy is probably the most valuable tool we have. I guess my problem is that somebody that's done all of that and harmed so many people get rewarded. And say me, for instance, I've never been baptized, never accepted Jesus. I would burn in hell for simply that reason, not because of anything that I've done or anything I've chosen not to do, but just simply because that's the reason. It seems really wrong to me.
Yeah, and I think that a big portion of the reason for that, kind of like I was saying, is and don't take this the wrong way, this is certainly no dig at you. I don't think you're any worse of a person than I would be, right? But I think if we were to live in a different set of, and by the way, I don't want to come across as hard deterministic. I am also compatibilistic like yourself, actually.
Okay.
Obviously from a theological perspective, but
yeah, sure.
Similar view. But I would be surprised if CJ and Mark 1,000 years from now were as enlightened and morally good as we are now. And that's mainly due to no fault of our own. I think it has a lot to do with the societies we grew up in. And in fact, you know, you just kind of brought up the...
Sorry to interrupt, CJ. Sorry, do you mean if we lived another 1,000 years, or do you mean if we were born 1,000 years from now?
Yeah, if we were born 1,000 years from now, you know, if we had grown up in, or if we were both Afghanis, right?
Right.
You know, or something along those lines. It would be, and the Afghani one is particularly interesting only because a lot of the violence perpetrated there is actually against your own tribe. And again, you know, not that there's anything unique about them, but when you look at things like they have like this whole really bizarre cultural practice about selling young boys 7, 8 years old into sexual slavery, right? We're not talking about selling people from, you know, for example, India into Afghani royal families or anything like that. We're talking about selling Afghani children into rich Afghani households. And you that almost kind of puts you in a rock and a hard place, kind of, and I don't mean you in particular, I mean everybody.
Yeah, sure.
Where, you know, we have the option of there's something fundamentally wrong with them, which is racism. That's not true. or we have the option of there's something fundamentally wrong with their culture, and that's probably true, but it doesn't seem like that should be enough for them to act in manners which are so detestable. And so the thing we're left with is it's almost like the culture is almost like a mechanism that allows them to do things they might have already done, provided they had the circumstances available to them. And we see an example of that, right? And if it's true for them, I see no reason to believe why it wouldn't be true for many of us,
Well,
right?
sure. But I mean, our entire legal system is based upon not how somebody thinks or how they're built. It's and what they do. And those people over in Afghanistan, I think that what's wrong is their evaluation of moral structure. That they have a meta-ethical framework of wanting to be either rich or get possessions for themselves or follow some kind of Islamic doctrine that is not compatible with what, say, a Western morality would be, whether that be a Christian morality or that be, for myself, sort of a meta-ethical relativism. I think that, and mine's based around well-being. So if I was to say, hey, if these people are after well-being, they shouldn't be selling kids into stuff, that's really wrong. That is so wrong, because it's detrimental to their own people. Whereas if all they care about is getting rich, or all they care about is following the Islamic doctrine that they've been brought up with, then yeah, of course they're going to do that. But I don't see that. I see that as a basis to judge whether somebody is a good person or not a good person, whether they are following their framework or not. And I don't think they are. I think they're doing it because like you said, their culture allows it, and that's the only thing that allows it. And I have no doubt if I was born in the same system that I may do the same thing. However, I'm not, and I don't. But the whole idea that it doesn't matter how good or evil you are in this world, how much destruction you wrought, or how much good things that you bring about to this world, you're going to be tortured forever. Like, not just for a little bit, not just until you pay your dues of whatever ill that you did, but tortured forever, regardless of how you behaved on this earth. That's the thing that sticks for me. And not that I believe in a hell. I mean, I'm not worried about it. It's just, it seems like a really weird thing for a benevolent God to do, is say, hey, I know you helped rape victims, and I know you helped people assaulted, and you helped all these people, but I'm going to burn you mercilessly forever because you didn't believe in me. While the person that went out, actually doing the rape and stealing from people and killing people, you're okay because you do believe in me. And that's the only criteria.
Yeah, and well, so let me say, I think two things that are important there. The first thing I do want to say, now this isn't going to be every Christian, so to be fair, this will change depending on who you talk to. But I am an annihilationist, which is just a fancy way of saying.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
I do believe the damned are ultimately in. So yeah, you already know what that means.
Yeah.
So there is a certain level of it mattering in that sense, as far as I don't expect somebody who was just the run-of-the-mill atheist grandma to be getting the same punishment as like an Adolf Hitler or something like that, right? But the second thing is, when you say I have no doubt that I may do some of the same things if I was in the same culture. Likewise, by the way, what that kind of reveals is a lot of our goodness really doesn't have a lot to do with how good we actually are. It has a lot to do with the society that has been built around us by circumstances completely outside of our control that has allowed us to operate in a relatively moralistic fashion. In other words, it's not so much that we don't have these evil tendencies somewhere deep within our own subconscious or anything like that. It's more just that we lived in a society where those things, either because they're frowned upon or because we have access to everything that we want and need at a readily available fashion, such that we don't need to steal them or anything like that, or whatever it happens to be. And in fact, even one good example, Western society has a really clever way of dealing with bloodlust by way of, like, for example, horror movies and stuff like that. We still go and pay, a certain amount of money, $10, 50 cents, whatever it happens to be, to go watch a Saw movie in the theaters. But rather than real individuals being tortured, it's people in a movie studio somewhere being tortured, quote unquote, right? So what does that demonstrate? Well, it demonstrates the people wanting to watch it do still have a kind of bloodlust. They would like to go pay money to see human beings be tortured. But we now as a society have built a way to do that doesn't actually torture people. Now, is that circumstances that allow the person to not actually act on their bloodlust in a real way? Or is that the person actually recognizing, hey, I don't want to actually go out and do something evil, so I'm going to go watch a movie instead? I think it's the former. I think if we lived in another society or at another place in time, those people would spend the same money, if not more, to go watch things that are much more violent and much more brutal. I'm a big football fan. As much as I love football, I can't necessarily say that I wouldn't be trading that out for something much more brutal if I lived 100 years ago, because obviously I'm a fan, right?
But you don't watch horror movies, do you?
I don't.
No.
Well, at least not those ones for sure. Those ones are kind of.
I think you've missed the point of horror movies, because the idea isn't that you go and watch torture, and I like horror movies, I must admit. But it's not the torture. The whole point of horror movies is so you get that endorphin rush from being scared or unnerved, or that feeling of fear that makes endorphins flow, and you sort of have this attitude. That it's because of the empathy with the characters in the movie that you feel the fear or the horror, for horror movies, that they feel, and that causes a secondhand endorphin rush. That's why horror movies are there. It's not. I think your sporting analogy is way better. That maybe we've alleviated bloodlust by having competitive sports, and you could certainly put MMA and things, and stuff like that in that camp, definitely, because it can get quite bloody at times. I'm not a fan, but you can certainly say, hey, that sport is the competition that used to be the gladiatorial arena. Absolutely, that's a valid argument. I don't think horror movies is, because that's not look. I don't doubt there's people out there that get thrilled by horror movies to watch that, but that's not the normative experience of people watching horror movies. People watch horror movies go because it's scary, not because it's in some way something to seek after, that it's in some way great that it's happening. I think you've got a wrong idea of horror movies there. So sorry to interrupt, CJ. Go, mate.
Well, no, you're totally fine. I think that it kind of depends on the person with that one. Certainly for some people, I think there's a level of truth to that, although I think one could argue that perhaps, even that endorphin thrill in and of itself is something which kind of, it could be the same thing that was being experienced by those in earlier times, right? But also,
Sure.
It's a very interesting quote. So, you ever heard of Wes Craven?
Yeah, he did the Nightmare on Elm Street series, I believe.
Yeah, and Scream also, and I think a couple others.
I haven't seen
People Under
that.
the Stairs and stuff like that.
Okay.
Now he doesn't do torture porn, which is what Saw is commonly referred to as. So it's a little bit different, and probably even more akin to what you're talking about rather than what I'm talking about. But in his earlier life, before he was a horror director, he was actually a pornography director.
Okay.
And he was asked, actually, after he had made this film, I can't remember what it's called. I think it's Wes Craven's New Nightmare. But it's like a fourth wall breaking Freddy movie where Freddy comes into the quote real world and starts attacking the actors and actresses and stuff like that.
Okay.
And in an interview he had done with that, he was asked about, hey, it seems kind of odd. How do you go from pornography to horror movies? And you're right, it just seems like a total genre switch. And not that he's the end all be all, but he was, the quote was basically him saying, well, really it's not. It's kind of the same bestial sort of primitive lust that I'm drawing upon. I'm just drawing upon a different one now. It used to be a sexual lust, and now it's a bloodlust, that I'm kind of directing and serving to an audience. And his point was just to say that there's a direct analogy that you could, at least in his own mind, a direct comparison you could make between something like pornography and something like a horror movie where you're watching people be murdered and stuff like that.
Yeah, maybe the slasher ones, sure. Yeah, maybe. That could be true. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry, you're totally good. My only point there is just to say, when we look at all these different kinds of things, football and horror movies and these other kinds of things, to me, what it demonstrates, and I'm not even necessarily wearing my theology cap as much as my philosophy cap here, it demonstrates to me this sort of greater truth of, like, we have kind of deceived ourselves with modern society into thinking we're not really that way anymore. But I think we are that way a lot of times. And some people like Dahmer are just a little bit more honest about it than the rest of us tend to be. I know that's a cynical way to look at humanity, but I think it kind of holds true when you look at a lot of these different things and societies, not only today, but in yesteryear, and just how different it is, the way that we're living and the way that our parents lived and their parents lived. Probably not their parents. Once you start getting 100 years back, you start getting pretty brutal. You know what I mean? Like,
I would agree with you. I'd 100% agree with you. I make no delusions that those sort of, let's call them bestial sort of impulses are still there. For instance, if, suddenly somebody attacked me on the street, it would get very nasty, and those things are there for a reason. And I'm not sure if you are subscribed to evolution, but evolutionarily speaking, there's a good reason for that. However, there are other emotional triggers that we do have, like empathy and sort of protectiveness and nurturing, and there are other things that we have that are just as strong as that impulse. I don't think there's any reason why we have to focus on these sort of one sort of, you sort of called them bloodlust. Sure, aggressiveness within humans is a problem. I'm not deluded about that. I'm not deluded about my own aggressiveness when I start to get mad and things like that. Nobody's sort of saying, hey, that's a thing of the past and we're suddenly all perfect. No. It's just there are other things we can draw upon that either negate or they are things that we can use instead of aggressiveness and bloodlust, as you call it, in order to sort of work as a society. Because humans are social animals, that we just are, or if you don't like that, but humans are social creatures of some sort.
Right.
And we have to work together, and that's where morality, I see morality as coming in. We can't just be aggressive to everybody around us and viciously violent with everybody around us, because that would be the collapse of human society. That would be the death of all humans, because humans can't survive alone. We don't live in a vacuum. We are necessarily dependent on the humans around us. So I really do agree with you that, hey, if you put us in Afghanistan, that our behaviour would be different based upon the things that we had learnt and we might tap into that aggressiveness a whole lot more raised under those circumstances. I have no doubt about that. I think you're 100% right. However, even within these Afghani tribes, there is people to a greater or lesser degree tapping into that viciousness and violence. Some people don't engage in these things, some people do. And yeah, I totally get what you're saying, that, hey, under that circumstance, that is then warranted, and then these people, subscribe to their more vicious and more violent bloodthirst kind of thing. Yeah, totally understand. But when you're looking at, good and evil and relative morality, you're looking at who within that context is actually doing these things or not doing these things. Because if we're all the same, everybody brought up in that civilization should be doing the same thing. Everybody brought up with these things are okay should be participating in that. But not everybody is. Not everybody is killing other tribes members, and not everybody is doing these things to young boys.
Right. And so one of the questions, of course, would become why, right?
Right.
I think that there can be a litany of different reasons for that. I do believe that, we're all, as far as my belief system is concerned, image bearers of God, who is a inherently moral being and an omnipotent being, omnibenevolent being. So while we have this one side of us that now we've been discussing for however long we've been discussing it, I think we also have another side that's kind of at war with it, which is what you would describe, I think, as empathy. Well, to be fair, we both would, but nonetheless, that's just where I believe that empathy.
You think it's derived from God?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So I think that's partially it. Also, of course, I think certain people would be changed by God in such a way that they would want to act that way. Also, though, there is something to be said about alternative. Of course, in the theological world, we call them sins, but we'll just say vices to not use such loaded language that kind of influence people to act in other ways. So, like, for example, and actually, I will use the Bible to amplify this example. So there's a portion where Jesus is saying to his disciples and the crowd around him, right? He's saying to love your neighbors and, do good to them that persecute you and all this other kind of stuff. And then he takes a moment to say, if you do good to those who are good to you, how are you any different than the tax collector? Which at the time, tax collectors are essentially thieves. They weren't analogous to our own IRS.
More bandit than tax collector. Yeah, I gotcha.
Yeah, certainly. And his point was, the tax collector loves his family. He loves his own. So how are you any different than him if you love your own? So love your enemy also, and love the stranger also, and all this other kind of stuff, right? And, one of the things that I think is kind of demonstrated there in the form of the tax collector is not killing anybody usually, hopefully at least. He's probably not a very good tax collector if he is, because they don't, dead people don't generate an income. But notice there's a reason to not partake in a bloody way or in a sexually deviant way or anything like that there, and it's still kind of selfish and evil, right? In this case, now it's so I can steal from you. Did you ever watch The Walking Dead?
Yeah, I saw the first few seasons.
Yeah. So another good example of that, although fictional, is Negan. He has his people are a resource quote. It's not that he cares about people; it's that people keep society running. They keep him in power. They keep him well fed, and all these other kinds of things. And so in both of these examples, one being biblical and one being fictional, what we kind of have here is like people demonstrating a reason to act, quote, good, that if you start to kind of chip away at it, isn't really that good at all. It's a means to a yet more evil end, right?
It's pragmatism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I think this is something we experience quite often. And there's so many different ways that we could just example into the dirt. I don't want to do that to you because then you'd have to just respond to all of them, and that's not fair. But nonetheless,
that's all right. Give me a try. I'll respond to all of them.
Well, I'll give you one last example, which is an example I actually know because of my real life.
Sure.
I won't put names to any of this for the sake of their own privacy, but I knew somebody once who would take care of her senile mother. And she was one of 5 children, and she was the only person who would take care of her senile mother up until that mother's dying day. And the mother was, just ruthlessly rude. Now, of course, senile, so it's not really her fault, but nonetheless, there was certainly no advantage that one would see at face value from watching this person do this, right? And she would go twice a week, every week, to go and take care of her senile mother who was at a old folks home. So she didn't necessarily have to, but nonetheless, spend some time with her and all that kind of stuff until eventually she passed on. And the reason she would do it, despite being one of 5 children, is the other 4 just wouldn't. Now, these other 4 they're not particularly bad people. They're pretty normal people, right? One's a businessman, one was a truck driver. They're just regular folk. And I knew them, and they're good, they're good people as well. in the sense of like, who we would in our normative human language refer to as good people. But there's all the various reasons. Well, I have other stuff going on in my life. Oh, it's too painful, all of that. And really, when you break it down to it, it's a lot of selfishness. And without taking anything away from the one who did go see her senile mother, even that was kind of a little bit of selfishness, because in the end, after the mother has died, there was this, well, I went and took care of, I'm a good person. I went and took care of my mother when none of you guys did. And, and it's like, and I'm not even trying to criticize that person, because the thing that they were doing was beautiful. Certainly they deserve a lot of credit for it. But the point is just to say they were put in the position of having to do it so constantly because her own siblings would not do it. And then after everything was said and done, there was even still a little bit of selfishness on her own part to say, I'm so much better than you guys because I did and you didn't. Now, that's not bloodlust. That's not sexual lust. That's not anything like that. But it's still this kind of like, nobody's a good person in this view, right? There's 4 people who are neglecting their birth giver, their mother. And there's another person who's using it almost as like a soapbox to make themselves feel better.
This is an excellent point, CJ. So what you're talking about is altruism through selfishness. That you like feeling good, so you go out and do good things because you like the feeling of, I'm a good person. Is that in fact good? And which is a wonderful question. It's excellent. So can you get to pure altruism through purely selfish means? And it's sort of, I've looked at it and said, well, the answer that I've come up with is, does it matter? Because the way that I describe good and evil is whether you are promoting well-being or sort of something detrimental to well-being. So the reasons why you're doing something kind of matter, but as long as you're going, well, I want to promote well-being, it isn't that much of a factor for me. The consequences, so consequentialism does play a part in my morality, that if you're doing something because, for instance, you want to live in a society where people take care of their elders, so you're doing it because you want that society, that could be described as selfish, but it's an incredibly altruistic act. It's doing good for society by doing that. So I would still classify that as a good act, regardless of her actual motivation to do it, because A, the intent is good. She's well, that's if she does indeed intend for society to take care of their elders, or she would like to be taken care of when she's older, basically. And the consequences are good as well. So I don't get that much into motivation as much as intent, if that makes sense.
Yeah, certainly. And for what it's worth, despite my reservations about the motivation and also the consequence of how she would lord this over people, I do find this person to have, I think it was an incredibly moral act, and I find this person to be commendable for it. So I do think there's a level of agreement that I would even have with you there. But I think when it comes to the question of like being an ultimately good person, it does seem to me like with the ultimate motivation is kind of yourself in a way. It detracts, I guess, a little bit, and maybe that's a matter of your own philosophy, certainly. But if the objectively good thing, provided that such a thing exists, which I don't know if you believe in moral realism or not, but I do.
I'm definitely an anti-realist.
Okay. So just for the sake of argument, we'll say it. We'll just say it was true just for now, just for the sake of argument, right? If there was an objective moral truth, and that objective moral truth was that people should care for their elders, then there does seem to be kind of a violation of that in the motivation being one's own personal pride, while also recognizing that what the person actually did in their actions was a good thing. But the reason even to remove moral realism from it, but this would add into it, especially if we had a moral realism in play. But even removing moral realism from it, the reason that detracts a little bit is because if you didn't have that same, circumstance, I guess, like if you couldn't lord this over somebody else, or if you didn't have a society that would eventually take care of you when you were older,
Right.
Or anything like that, would you still have done it? And if that is your motivation, I think it's reasonable to assume you might not have, right? Yeah. And that, in my opinion, kind of, excuse me, I'm stuttering a little bit, kind of detracts a little bit from the altruistic act in and of itself. And it's always hard to say, because it's like, I don't want to criticize the person for doing something that's good, right? You want people to do good things, even if their motivations maybe aren't particularly great. But when you get into the philosophical elements of like, well, if you had this other situation, would you still have done it? And the answer, it comes down to like being no. It kind of makes me wonder, okay, well, so are you really a good person in a genuinely moral sense, or are you more like, are we back to the whole question of this is a matter of circumstance? And it does kind of say, and
I don't think it matters to me. I honestly don't think it matters to me. Some people do, like the positive feeling they get by helping people and do it for no other reason than that. I don't think that detracts anything from the deed that they've done or the motivation that they've had. Certainly not if I'm the recipient, I really need a drink and somebody says, here, have this water. I will say, hey, regardless of whether that made them feel good to do it or not, it's still something I can really appreciate. I don't think it detracts at all. And what's weird is the way you said, well, if objective morality is true, and let's grant that for a second, that it detracts when she's only doing it because she likes to say, hey, I did this good thing afterwards. That's sort of a statement of not only that you've got to follow the objective morality, but you've got to want to follow the objective morality, which if that was true, I think there'd be, a lot of Christians that would have problems following, not only just following morality, but wanting to follow morality. Going, hey, this is, I really want to, ditch church and go off to here or whatever. If it's objectively moral to go to church, there's a lot of Christians that don't want to, but they still do. So I think that's a problem, because you would still see it as, well, it may even be a better thing if they don't want to go and then they decided to anyway, even though they didn't want to, in order to, go to heaven or something like that. I don't think that necessarily says that that's not a moral act, because they didn't really want to and have this other thing, which may indeed be selfish, to sort of say, hey, I do want to, the love of God and to go to heaven, to guide me on my morality. I think there's a lot of Christians that wouldn't adhere to that, or wouldn't fulfill that objective morality if they have to want to, I guess is what I'm saying, in a really bad way.
Yeah, well, no, you're. I think it is totally coherent, and it's not a bad point. And there's even something, even outside of the theistic worldview, there's certainly something to be said about somebody who wants to do the right thing, or wants to do the wrong thing rather, but does the right thing anyway.
Right.
And that's, in a way, that's like a TV trope or a literature trope in a lot of ways, right? Because it's sort of like a demonstration of being a good person.
Yeah, character arc kind of thing.
Yeah. I think one thing you typically notice, though, in those kinds of tropes, and actually it's very interesting that you came in to talk about this tonight, because as it turns out, my debate tonight was kind of related to this in a way.
Oh, I didn't catch it. I'm sorry.
Oh no, you're totally fine. This is an excellent portion of the program. I appreciate you coming in. Typically, like, for example, when you have the, I'll use a very soft example because it's not going to take too much thinking, but in Sesame Street, Elmo is a character who is annoying him with her imaginary friend whose name is Rocco.
Okay.
And Elmo's like, Rocco's a rock, so I don't know why I have to, like, allow Rocco to do, like, for example, take my spot on the swing or something like that. But ultimately, Elmo relents and lets Rocco, quote unquote, play on the swing and all this other kind of stuff, because it makes the other girl, whose name is fleeting me, feel better.
Right.
In other words, he doesn't want to do the quote right thing here and be selfless, but he does because he's trying to be better for her, right? But there's a character arc there where at the end of it, he's ultimately actually more in the camp of wanting to do that, right? In other words, when you start the episode, he's begrudgingly, well, when you start the episode, he's just outright indignant. He doesn't want to do it at all.
Sure.
And by the middle of the episode, he's begrudgingly doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And by the end of the episode, he's willingly and joyously doing it, and everybody gets along and sings Kumbaya, right?
Yeah. And that's because he likes to see her happy. It makes him feel good. Because when she's happy, he feels good. And that's your sense of empathy. That's exactly what empathy is.
Right. And so when you, Zoe, Truth Defenders.
Okay. I'm really sorry. I haven't done Sesame Street at all. Not at all. It's not a thing that I've done at all.
I haven't in quite some time, so
Right.
I certainly understand that. I mean, I'm 24 now. It's probably been, it's got to be over 15 years at least.
Sure, but
anyway,
I mean, I'm aware of it, so that there's definitely moral lessons you can take away that even though there's something you don't want to do, that having somebody else happy so you feel good is a moral thing to do, and I would agree. But you could almost point Elmo and go, well, you're being selfish because you're getting a good feeling from seeing somebody else happy. And that's where altruism by pure selfishness comes about. If you're getting a good feeling out and you go, hey, I like to help people, does it really matter if that is a selfish thing to make people happy because you're happy that they're happy, right? Is that selfish? Is that moral? And I think it doesn't matter. I think that regardless of the reason, the act itself, because the consequences are good, it is a good act, and that's how I would sort of decry it. I don't think it matters that Elmo gets a good feeling and that's why he's doing it. I don't think that matters. But I guess... Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go CJ.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, I think there's certainly a level of truth to what you're saying that I don't want to just disregard, but I think that the greater point of the story arc you have here, which is not unique, of course, to Sesame Street, it happens in plenty of other stories all the time. It's actually kind of a trope, like I said, is that it's not just that he's getting happy from her being happy. It's more like you're seeing like a growth in the individual, that it's like, I'm not begrudgingly doing the right thing anymore, but actually I am being changed to actually want to do the right thing. Now, I don't know if in real life this kind of thing happens as often as it does in fiction, which is a little bit of my cynicism coming in again. But the point there you kind of see is it's like the begrudging moving to the right thing is supposed to be temporary, right? And hopefully eventually to train the individual into something that, makes them want to do the right thing in a way that is truly selfless. And I think that, unfortunately, I don't know if most people ever actually make that jump. I think for a lot of people, it stays kind of where you're saying, right? Where it's like, it is ultimately kind of a selfish thing. And the reason that becomes important, like I was saying earlier, is because when you talk about selfless versus selfish when it comes to good deeds, a selfish good deed being predicated on that which benefits you would not happen if you didn't get that benefit any longer. But a selfless good deed, since it's not predicated on that benefit to you, you would still do even if you didn't have that benefit. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's, I think...
I think, though, when you're talking about actions that are improving society, it's very hard to go, well, we're not going to get that benefit, to take away that benefit. So I would use an analogy like, have you ever been to the shopping centre and people just leave their trolleys everywhere kind of thing? And I will put mine back in the return bay every single time because I want to live in a world where we put our trolleys back. And if everybody did the same thing, it would be a mess in the shopping centre, right? It would be a horrible place.
Right.
So if so basically, if someone came around to collect them, kind of thing, and it wouldn't be a problem, would I still do that? Yes, I would still do that because it's a better place to live. I'm not sure how you could take that away. It sort of is like, well, if you're doing things for the benefit of society, or in the ideal of reciprocity, like you let people in when you change lane or when they're changing lanes, because I want to live in a world where if I've got to change lane to be let in, that might be in a very roundabout way selfish because I want a world to live in. But if somebody doesn't let me in, I don't stop doing it. Does that make sense? Because that's the world I want to live in. I've got to do that to start off with. Yeah, but it is a good point. Like if somebody being happy no longer made you happy, would you still make others happy? And there's a great segue there back to, if you're a psychopath and can't feel the joy of other people, you seriously cannot even understand what they would be happy about. Would you do nice things? And the answer is no, they don't. Not by themselves, without something for them, like some sort of reward, some sort of tangible thing that they can get hold of. Because, and it's not their fault, they just don't have that sense of empathy that when someone else is happy, they're like, oh, they're happy, that's really good. It just doesn't exist for them. So I think in that case, yeah, I think if you take away that from anybody, they're not, if Elmo was a psychopath, he wouldn't care about the imaginary friend.
Yeah, and so now this it does actually bring us back, and I wonder, I don't know the answer to this question, but I would be interested to know if whether because of some sort of spiritual endeavor or maybe because of some intellectual endeavor, if a psychopath might actually do such a, because in other words, let me kind of put it, I could imagine a scenario, and again, I don't know the science behind this, so I don't know if it's true, but I could imagine a scenario where a psychopath has an intellectual understanding that or maybe what we would term theologically as like a spiritual understanding, which I would recognize for you might be the same thing, being that you don't believe in God and stuff like that, but nonetheless, I could imagine a world where that person has an intellectual understanding of the good that is done by way of what they're doing, and so therefore it still does act in what we would consider the morally righteous way or right way, even despite not having that empathy.
Oh, right? Absolutely, yeah. And there's plenty of psychopaths that operate within society and don't do a thing wrong. They're perfect citizens. They just, to others, they just aren't connected. They don't have that connection there.
Right, and so and certainly a lot of them would fit into the same category, which you were speaking of, which I was even extending to other people, where it's like, okay, well, society benefits me for this, that, and the third.
Right.
But I would imagine there's at least some, for whatever reason, who just have a intellectual understanding of it and do it on the basis of that alone. And I would wager that they might be particularly religious lot, although that may not necessarily be the case. It does seem religiosity in society does tend to have an impact on people's behavior, and that is not just Christianity per se, but even I live in an area of the country that's very Mormon. Mormons are very, very fine people. It's they have a belief system that teaches them to be kind to their fellow man. I greatly appreciate that. But regardless, the point is just to say I could imagine, whether it be because of religion or philosophy or intellect or something like that, somebody not having that empathy and also not having that benefit, but still potentially wanting to do, because of what they have understood intellectually, that good thing.
Sure.
I would suspect, if such a thing does exist, though, that it's probably, like I said, a particularly religious psychopath. And there'd be various things we could get into to that. Is that because religion is an opium of the people, or is it because there's something genuine about religious belief or something like that? I guess that, in other words, I guess now that I'm saying that, it wouldn't necessarily help our conversation per se.
No, that's
thing.
okay. That's all right. No, I get it. I guess. And is that Nanya? Is that Nanya's beautiful face I see there?
It is.
Nanya, how you doing, buddy? It's been ages since I've seen you. I hope you're well. Yeah. So, I guess, and I want to get on to if you're talking about sort of doing good things for the sake of morality and sort of this idea that you'll get into heaven. What I don't see is the motivation to do good things on earth if the criteria is there to just believe in a savior to get into heaven. It seems like you could do, or it seems like to me, I guess, you could do whatever you want and then sort of accept Jesus afterwards, and there isn't necessarily a consequence for your behavior on earth.
Yeah, so that is an excellent point, and actually that goes directly into the debate I had been having today. So to give you some backstory on
Okay,
what
sure.
it was.
Yeah.
So it was a position. The debate was on lordship salvation versus free grace. So what do those terms mean, right? So my position, which is the lordship salvation position, is that now bear in mind both of us are coming from the perspective that Jesus is truly God,
Sure,
and that God,
sure.
of course, exists in that instance. My position, which is the lordship salvation position, or just lordship for short, basically says that when somebody has a genuine conversion experience, and we take into account, there are certainly make believers, there are selfish believers, there are non-believers, et cetera. But when someone has a genuine experience with God, it does change people in such a way that doesn't, that ends up not being the case, where you just want to do everything you can, right? In other words, it's like, so the law's penalty is no longer on your head, but you don't want to do the kinds of things that would put the law's penalty on your head because you've been, as the scripture would put it, regenerated, or fundamentally changed, right? In such a way that you want to act in a manner that is in line with God's teachings. The free grace position is, as you can imagine, the opposite of that. Salvation is kind of what you were talking about, right? It's the acceptance of this set of facts,
Okay.
and really nothing more, right? Not nothing more in the sense that you have to do something, because, like I said, in the lordship view, it's God that's doing the thing and not necessarily you. But nonetheless, if on the free grace view, Dahmer were to get out of prison and return to doing what he did, it would kind of be, from an ultimate perspective, no harm, no foul. They have ways of dealing with it, such as eternal rewards
So
and
is
stuff
that
like that.
the
But
once
ultimately,
saved, forever saved kind of deal?
technically, we both are.
Okay.
The difference there is that, on my view, the person who is saved is basically starting a process of not just their own salvation, which does happen in that instant, but also of a sanctification that eventually is leading you to the path of being a fundamentally different person. You could use, for a explicitly biblical example, Paul. I don't know how much you would accept about the historicity of Paul, but just taking the story at face value,
Sure.
he was essentially a vicious religious zealot, going out killing people in the name of Judaism, converted to Christianity, and then ultimately never picked up a sword again, being unwilling to persecute anybody, and in fact being willing to be put under persecution, and not retaliating in a violent manner and stuff like that, which is even going above and beyond, right? I don't think self-defense is immoral, but the point is he's so detached now from violence that he doesn't even do that moral violence of
Okay.
self-defense, right? So on this lordship view, if Dahmer hypothetically were to get out of prison, if he genuinely was saved, if there's a real God who really saved him, regenerated him, rejuvenated him, he wouldn't want to do those things anymore. And in fact, he may even feel a deep urge to atone for those, which of course, not such a thing is not really possible. But perhaps he wants to, speak out to other troubled people, whether he wants to speak to people who are feeling isolated, or people who are closeted, or people who just have violent tendencies for any various reasons, right? And essentially trying to like help people. And I'm not saying this is a requirement, but just, the point is just to say that you would see that change in a demonstrated fashion. And if he, under my view, if he came out and wasn't doing that, if he wasn't demonstrating some kind of a change, it would indicate that maybe this is all just a facade, that he wasn't actually somebody who was regenerated in the first place. Whereas there is that free grace view then, which would be more akin to what you're talking about, where if he accepted the set of facts, well, then it doesn't really matter if he had a regeneration or not, because the acceptance of the set of facts doesn't necessarily lead to that. So that's just a long-winded way of me saying now on my view, and in what I believe is the biblical view, of course, right? Otherwise I wouldn't believe it. I think that somebody who does actually have a repentant heart, if repentance is understood as metanoia, which is the original Greek word, which means a changing of mind, I think it does lead to necessarily a change in behavior, where somebody doesn't want to do those things anymore, and like I said, may even feel the deep urge to atone for those things in whatever way they possibly could. Which, in a very real sense, I mean, in an egregious crime, there's really nothing you can do to atone, but I think you get the idea I'm laying out.
So can Dharma change his entire perspective for like 20 years and then go, fall again? So there's no way he can drop off after that?
I don't think that he would ever drop off to the same extent. I think he could drop off in ways. So I'll just take, for example, the drinking, because that's something that was a big part of how he was able to detach himself and do the crimes he did. Could he fall off the wagon and become an alcoholic again? Probably. Could he even fall off the sort of sexual wagon and start going back into promiscuous sex, or even a homosexual relationship or something like that? I could see that. You're talking about somebody who's starting from a position that's way farther back.
But is he still saved at that point?
Right, and because he was saved at that point, he's not ever going to, I think, fall back into the same level he was at. In other words, you can kind of think of it like going over a mountain range. You might get into valleys, but you're always going up.
Right.
In your absolute sense, right? You're never going to get back down to sea level. It might be going down from 100 feet down into 40 feet, but sea level was at the start of this, and you're not going back to sea level, and eventually you're going to get at the top somewhere. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's also that, just say a Christian is saved and does make a big change in their personality, but still looks at women with lust in his heart, kind of thing. Is that means that he's not saved, or is it that he's once saved, forever saved, and that's just a blip on the radar? Or what are we considering to be the consequences of a changed person messing up again?
Yeah, and so it would be one of those things where it's like, I think that it's certainly possible for people to make mistakes again, but because of the trajectory, you wouldn't expect those mistakes to be the same. And actually, there's a good real life example of this in the form of, I actually used this example earlier in the show. Sorry, I dropped my pen and now I'm looking for it and it doesn't really matter. But anyways, DMX, the rapper, was converted to Christianity very early on in his life. And at the time that he was converted, he was an alcoholic, a drug addict, a nicotine addict, a wife, adulterer, wife beater, terrible father, gangster. I mean, there's a whole list of things, right?
Right.
Eventually, he died about age 50 of a heroin overdose, something like 25 years after his conversion. I don't know how old he was exactly when he converted, but it was some time, right? Sure. There was certainly some time. And one might be tempted to look at that and say, okay, doesn't appear like he ever had that change that CJ is talking about. But if you actually examine the trajectory of his life, he became a very good father. He quit being a womanizer. He had narrowed himself down to the single drug of heroin, was able to beat, crack and all these other kinds of drugs. Was no longer involved in gang violence and stuff like that. And so was there a lapse? Not only was there a lapse, but unfortunately the lapse killed him.
It's fatal, yeah.
Yeah. But when you look at the trajectory of his life, there was also a very clear pivot that really never went away, right? Like when you're talking about somebody being addicted to one drug versus somebody being addicted to many drugs and also a gangster and also a wife beater and also an adulterer, you know what I mean? It's like there's a clear pivoting that happened here, even though he ultimately ended up dying as a result of one of these vices he was never actually able to conquer.
Right.
And as a result, I think his conversion was genuine because of how
Oh,
far he
real
had
quick.
actually come.
Real quick, you can continue. It's 4:02. Time for all dyslexics to get high.
That's funny. That's real funny, actually.
Well, what's the significance of 240? I don't understand. Little add-on joke for you, Nanya. What was I going to say? Oh, yeah. So DMX is in heaven, and I guess I want to pair that with, say, my own life. And, you know, like I was rowdy when I was younger. I drank a bit and, you know, did some stuff, but I was never a drug addict. I never beat a wife, never attacked anybody, never did any, wasn't a gangster. Have tried to be nice and kind throughout all of my life. Never accepted Jesus. Never, you know, did heroin, and you know, I'm annihilated, and DMX is in heaven. It seems like a very weird way to evaluate the how somebody has lived, or the you know how well they have contributed to humanity or this world in
Well, I
its
think
entirety.
just to, I know CJ's got an answer for you, but I want him to also consider along the lines. I mean, if you've ever seen like anything from Hollywood, we are taught that it seems like the way you go down is relative to your sin. Just consider that in your answer, CJ.
What do you mean way you go down? What do you mean by that?
Well, like your death. Oh, he died in his sleep at 98. Yeah. Oh, that sounds pretty darn good. Oh, yeah, that 12-year-old 16-year-old texting while driving got decapitated. Oh, yeah, that's ooh,
Well,
ooh.
I wouldn't take Hollywood as to be especially representative of real life. I mean, my mother died of breast cancer, and my dad died of you know a heart issue. Even though he was an avid jogger and was very fit, I don't think that's you know sort of as far as sins go. I don't know what kind of sin you would commit to incur you know something as horrible as cancer or breast cancer or something like that. I don't see that representative as real life, Nanya. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and you know, I certainly do. Also want to you know take into account the fact that I have known very many, not only very good people but also believers to boot, who have gone through some pretty hellacious things.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, I'm not stigmatizing them for that. No, it's just I just want to know. It seems a very unfair criteria to come to this person deserves eternal bliss or annihilation based upon the single criteria of whether or not they believe that a itinerant Jewish preacher was in fact God.
Well, and I think it goes back to that kind of thing we were talking about earlier, right? Where it's like I think before a perfectly righteous being, who we would term as God, we're all kind of out of the loop, and hence the necessity for that salvation atonement. But it's sort of so it's kind of like, in other words, you know, would you have a similar trajectory to DMX in that you were once a ruffian and now are no longer?
Um, no, I wasn't a ruffian. I had a, you know, I probably ran with the wrong crowd, but you know, I wasn't a gangster hurting people or anything like
Right.
that. No.
Well, so we'll say, so from the Christian perspective, like I was kind of saying, it is one of those things where, and even just from my own philosophical perspective, which to be honest probably wouldn't even change if I wasn't a theist, only because it has a lot more to do with human nature, as we've probably deduced in the last
Yeah.
couple hours or however long it's been. But nevertheless, you know, being if everybody is guilty before a righteous being and in need of that atonement, that's why the accepting of that atonement would be the differentiating factor. However, if one was truly to accept that atonement and therefore be indwelt by this all righteous being, perfectly righteous being, according to what is laid out in this Bible, we would expect them to also have a change in their behavior such that they didn't, want to do those kinds of things anymore, and would also have a trajectory that is leading in an upwards direction. Which is where the kind of DMX example there would come in. And from the perspective that I'm kind of laying out here, one thing we got to understand is I don't think there's anything fair about me going to heaven and you going to hell, which I'm not necessarily saying you are or aren't. Obviously, I don't know where your life is going to end up going. But because in reality, I think we both deserve it. If I'm being very honest, right? I think that humanity as a whole is just to put you on.
I'm going to put you on the spot. According to your criteria, I am going to hell, whether that be annihilation or whether that be, sort of brimstone and fire. That's your criteria. By that criteria, I am.
And that would be true.
Don't be shy about it, CJ. If that's what you believe, that's what you believe. But that is the criteria, right?
Right, and yeah, I certainly don't want to yank your chain or anything. That certainly is the case. In fact, I'll just even be perfectly frank about it. There'd be no way in a hypothetical world where Mark Reid becomes a Christian. He's certainly not going to become a Christian because I lied to him about whether or not he was in a good standing when he wasn't a Christian. You know what I mean? So, and I do want to certainly be honest about that. But in my view, I don't think you're any more or less deserving of that than I am. I think we're on equal ground. You know what I mean? I think that we're both, we are both perfectly condemned in the sight of a righteous God. Hence the necessity for the accepting of that atonement, right? Because notice, it's not just simply that you believed in him, but it's also the accepting of this atonement that he's actually put forward by way of the crucifixion. Which is, to be crude with it, it's a little bit of a blood sacrifice, kind of, right?
Sure.
And what that essentially does is, in the eyes of God, you could think of it like a court, right? There's a judge, God the Father, here, and he's looking over the cases of each individual human, and each individual time, crime, guilty, right? So in this kind of scenario, you'd have Mark comes up and it's crime, guilty, gavel swung, and we're done, right? And then CJ walks up and it's blank. Now, is it because I didn't commit any crimes and I'm better than Mark? Absolutely not. Rather, the attorney I have, for lack of a better term, has imputed his own righteousness onto me, such that now what he was accomplishing in his life, not sinning at all, has now been transferred over to me. And now when that judge is looking at me, he's not seeing anything anymore. It's not that I deserved it, or that that you were any less worthy than I was. We were on the same page, right? But that attorney made the entire difference, because it's not my righteousness that this judge is looking at, it's his. Now, that's not how our court system works, but it's a crude analogy to kind of...
Yeah, that would be a miscarriage of justice if the fact that you have an attorney the quality of your attorney should not ought to make an impact on whether you have actually done the crime or not done the crime. It shouldn't...
Right, and
that's an
certainly a crude analogy, right?
Sure.
But the only point of bringing it up is just simply to say, we're in the same court system, and very often even going to be being held accountable for the same crimes. The sole difference between the believer and the non-believer is that because the believer has accepted that atonement is a washing away of those sins and an imputation of the righteousness of the atoner onto the person who was atoned for, right?
Yeah. So the court analogy is probably a pretty bad analogy, because in our court system, and you're probably saying it, the one with the blindfold, justice is supposed to be blind. It doesn't. Right. So what you've got is basically where everybody's found guilty unless unless the person in some way genuflects or praises the judge or believes that their lawyer does whatever, and then they're not suffer the consequences of their actions. I couldn't think of, in real world terms, a horrendous justice system that would sentence people equally, because we're really talking about the same sentence rather than just a guilty or not guilty verdict. The sentence people equally, based upon whether their lawyer is present. If they get off, and if their lawyer's not present, they get sentenced to the same conviction, whether or not, regardless of what their crime was. So I think that courtroom analogy is bad, because if you place that in real life, it would be the most horrendous, evil court system that you could probably ever devise. And I get it that you're saying that God has a special sort of system here, but I just can't wrap my mind around the idea of a benevolent God that implements a system that punishes all crimes equally, unless you accept themselves or their son, whichever perspective you're looking at, as somebody to save you.
Yeah, and I think a big portion of the reason why it may not make as much sense to the modern mind, but not to say that that's simply the only reason you're not getting it, because I get your point. The analogy is a little bit crude on my part, maybe a lot of it crude on my part, if I'm being honest. But we don't really have atonement so much as a concept in our societies anymore. It used to, of course, be everywhere, right? Everybody had these different sacrifices and things like that.
We kind of do. I mean, you can get reduced sentencing for showing what's the word I'm thinking of? Regret, remorse, right? You can get a lowered sentence if you show true remorse for what you've done, plead guilty, and then say, hey, I made a mistake, I'm really sorry. You'll get a reduced sentence, right? So the court may go easy on you because you are accepting the consequences of your decisions and showing that, hey, I feel really bad for what I did, and they might reduce your sentence, but that's not what we've got here.
Well, and so I guess in a way, I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because in a way that does kind of help with, help it to kind of explain what I'm saying, in the sense that, so we do have a modern example of the repentant soul, quote unquote, getting this sentence either reduced or even in some instances, obviously in this case, it would be something where the crime is not typically that severe, maybe even a eliminated sentence. So maybe not eliminated entirely, I guess. But you could see a scenario where two men smoke the same joint,
sure,
and one ends up going to jail and the other one ends up, maybe paying a small fine and doing some community service or something like that on the basis of their repentance. And so there is a similarity there.
Okay.
I think that the main difference, even in that instance, which of course is not any fault to your own, especially since I'm the one who brought up the analogy, would just simply be the nature of this atoning sacrifice, which imputes the righteousness of the sacrifice itself, namely Christ, onto the individual, namely I or you or whoever is sitting there before the judge. It's kind of like the penalty you were supposed to get is the penalty that he took, but because he was not actually guilty of any crime, the penalty's not able to keep him.
Yeah, that's something that I can't get behind, the idea that somebody else pays the penalty for whatever I've done wrong. I think that sort of morally speaking, I would be happier to take whatever penalty that I have committed rather than putting it onto somebody else. I don't think that's a very moral thing to do, and certainly, sort of taking your court analogy, it'd be a horrible thing, right? If the judge brought out his son and killed them and said, well, you can all go free now, as long as you believe that was the thing that saved you. I think that
amen.
would be...
Amen, Mark Reid, and that Torah does not allow that either. So amen both ways.
Okay. Well, I mean, I don't. I must admit, I haven't studied the Torah that much, Nanya. I really haven't. But
Well, no, for the good Christians out there that are trying to say that's what's going on, it's like, well, the good Lord wouldn't have allowed that through the Old Testament. So wake up.
okay.
But yeah, go ahead.
Well, and obviously, I think we'd have a pretty big difference between me and Nunya there in that instance.
Right.
But nonetheless, of course, that's what's this whole platform for, if not the expressing of different views, right? So, so I don't want to end this too prematurely, but we are getting about to the 5-hour
no
mark.
problems
So I
at
want to
all.
start the
Yeah,
timer
no
a little
problems
bit.
at all. Sorry, mate. That was a really interesting conversation. I'm so glad I came on. Yeah, and thank you for letting me on and talking with me. And Nanya, always good to see your beautiful face, mate. You are a champ. Yeah, Nanya and I actually go back to Amy's stream we met on. So yeah, very.
Oh, she is so funny. Amy Newman, excuse me, Amy Newman is so funny. I won't even send you to some of the places to verify that because you would the good Christians would probably find it offensive. But if you have ever seen the movie the Name of the Rose, you should not be afraid to laugh when reading the Bible.
Hey, quick question. Is it daylight savings tonight? My clock says 1:18, but it was 1:18 an hour ago.
Which
Central America,
area?
yeah.
Yeah. I think it's coming up very soon. I'm not sure if it's changed over. What time zone are you in?
Central USA. I'm in Central USA, and yes, the time change here. I'm sorry, I said Central America. I meant Central USA.
Yeah, Central time. Yeah.
Jay, go ahead.
All right, yeah. What do you know? We just gained an extra hour. That's actually very useful considering.
Well, I would like 5 minutes of that hour.
I'm glad you told me. I am glad you told me.
I want to tell you. I want to tell both of you two guys. Where's it at? I want to tell that guy right there, and I want to tell that guy right there.
Yeah, that's the way.
Yeah. I got 5 minutes of something to say to y'all.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, man.
I'm listening.
Oh, thank you. And the guy right up there, if he's not sleeping.
Jamie. Yeah.
And since y'all agreed, I lied to you. It's not 5 minutes. It's probably just about 10, 15 seconds. But I'm 61, born in 60.
You're waiting
for
420, aren't you?
Oh, 419. Got a minute?
Yeah, he's waiting for 420. Yeah.
No, we don't really. Yeah, I can't even remember the last time I got high. I mean, oh my God, alcohol. Geez, 1988.
Getting high is actually potentially leading you to not remember the last time. I'm just kidding.
But no,
I don't do any of that anymore. I don't even really drink anymore. Yeah, I generally don't do any of that.
Yeah, just real quick, going through my life, like your typical, just to, like 70s and such, we would drive around, we would get drunk, we'd go to people's houses. There was a wedding every weekend, a polka, a open bar, underage. Everybody would get drunk. We would all go driving. In my 20s, we're going to the bars. We're going to the clubs, I guess you'd call it nowadays. My 30s, I don't know. We're trying to get married, but we're still screwing around with other people. 40s, 50s, 60s. So as like I say, I'm 60 now, and I've never been so proud to see people like Mark Reid, Jamie. I won't say your real last name. CJ. Grown men. Okay, you guys aren't 12. You guys are like, I don't know how, 24. Chris Lucas, happy birthday last night. You guys are young compared to me. I'm so proud. I don't care what your views are. Oh my God. Poke me with a fork. I think I'm done. I'm so proud of you guys for discussing God. We would never have done that in the club, in the bar, driving around drinking. We were Catholics. We would see each other at church 5 times a week. We were in the school. We went to church Monday, and then the families on Sunday. But no, we never spoke about God. And you guys are doing this for fun? I'm so proud of you. I don't care your view. I don't care as far as this little speech is concerned. I don't care your view. You guys are awesome for asking, seeking, knocking. That's all I got, brothers.
Yeah, no worries, Nanya.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, and I do appreciate that quite a bit because, well, I'll just put it this way: I'm typically the youngest guy in the rooms that I'm in here, and I do like the positive affirmation of my elders. I mean that very genuinely. I was raised to respect my elders, and at this point, that's virtually everybody. So, but nonetheless, so. Jungle, I guess, just joined us here. We're gonna just so you know, Jungle, we're about to kind of close everything down. I do apologize.
Yeah, sorry, mate, we're wrapping up.
Yeah, I know. I was just hearing in the conversation. I wanted to try to explain the atonement a little bit to Mark, if I could, maybe a little bit.
Jungle's got a history of just sort of asking me very strange questions that just make no sense to me. But go ahead. Do your thing. Well, I guess we should check with CJ. Are you happy, CJ, or do you want to wrap it up, mate? This is your stream.
Well, so
it's just it won't take too long.
I feel like it might end up taking maybe a little more time than we might want. So here, I'll say this. Jungle, go ahead and give a couple thoughts. But we probably won't provide you with the most time. I do apologize for that. I did a 3-hour day plus the 5 hours here. I'm just kind of exhausted.
That's totally understandable. That's understandable, mate. Absolutely.
And I can understand. I just wanted to see if I could explain a little bit to Mark what the issue is that God is our creator. He's not one of us. If he was one of us, of course, atonement would be wrong. But the way you have to look at it is like he's the creator. He's holy. He can't allow sin. And yet he gives us a free will, his creation. So his creation then sinned. So who is it on? Who is the sin on? If his creation sins, it's on him. It's on God. So in a sense, when we sinned, we killed God. And except that we aren't God, but God is everywhere and everything. So we killed God in the creation that he made. And so we not only did it figuratively, we did it literally, by killing God's son. And God planned it that way because that's exactly what we did anyways. So does that explain it a little bit better, or does it help?
Not really. I mean, I don't think that God is our creator, and killing somebody because God wants that to happen. I don't understand how that's a sin if you're doing what God wants.
Well, it's covering that he gave us, that he made for us to cover for us. And that's the only reason why we're alive right now, is because we have a covering for ourselves. Because we can't, you can understand that a holy God can't have sin. It would have to be annihilated. If there's sin before God, it'd have to be annihilated.
Well, okay, but if he just needs to forgive sin, why doesn't he just forgive the sin? Why does he set up that we've got to kill his son or himself in order to forgive that sin?
Well, see, that's the thing. He can't forgive sin. He has to punish sin.
Okay.
So instead of punishing us, he punished his son, so that we would be able to live.
Well, why doesn't he just punish a hedgehog or something?
Well, because the hedgehog didn't sin.
The hedgehog didn't sin. Okay, that makes no sense to me. That's okay. We can wrap it up if you want. I don't really.
Yeah, I figure I'd give a shot. I mean, It has to be the Holy
okay,
Spirit that
that's all right.
convicts you anyway and explains it to you so
Okay.
you understand.
No worries. Well, I'll wait
Anyway.
for the Holy Spirit then. Thank you anyway, George.
Well, yeah, he speaks to everybody. The Holy Spirit
Okay.
speaks to everybody. Everybody has, so nobody's has an excuse.
Okay.
Well, and with that, friends, I'll go ahead and give anybody some last words if they like, kind of around the room here, and then
I just want to
I do
thank you for
appreciate
having me on. Yeah, thank you so much, CJ. It's been a blast. I had a great time. And you know, do like and subscribe to CJ because he certainly deserves it. Runs a great room. This first time I've been here, and I think it's a great room. So, cheers. Thank you.
I appreciate that, and you. First off, likewise, I thought this was an absolutely excellent conversation. And you're on top of being very intelligent, very respectful as well. So I appreciate that a lot. And anytime, man, if you want to either do, come on one of these rooms or even have a conversation kind of one-on-one or even a debate, I'd certainly be willing. So,
sure.
Absolutely. So with that, friends, I bid you all adieu. We're going to go ahead and call it quits for tonight. If you liked this, please remember to like and share this video. And please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit the bell to get notified every time that we go live. If you would like to